It was the autumn of 1882, somewhere in the deep American South, perhaps Mississippi, maybe Georgia. The precise location long since dissolved into the fog of undocumented memory. Clears throat inside a modest photography studio. A black family assembles with a formality that feels almost ceremonial. They are dressed in their finest clothes, the father in a pressed dark suit, the mother in a high-collared blouse, the children in stiff, clean garments that smell of lye soap and hope. They pose with a quiet dignity that suggests this is not merely a portrait, but a declaration, a statement that despite everything, they exist, they are together, and they are worthy of remembrance. At first glance, the image could pass for any of the hundreds of thousands of cabinet cards from that era. A frozen slice of Victorian life, purchased with coins that represented real sacrifice. But a photograph, like a locked door, sometimes waits more than a century for the right key. Now look closer. Specifically, look at the youngest member of this family, a small girl standing at the extreme edge of the frame, almost as if she were an afterthought, or perhaps someone who had learned early to stay near the margins. In her eyes, something has been hiding in plain sight for over 140 years. Something that, when a genetic historian finally examined this photograph under high-resolution digital magnification, caused him to go completely silent. Not because the image was damaged or faded, but because what he found defied the casual assumptions we make about race, heredity, and the stories our bodies carry. It was not merely a physical trait, like the shape of a nose or the curve of a lip. It was a key, a biological key, encoded in her DNA, that had survived the Middle Passage, survived the systematic erasure of slavery, survived generations of enforced silence and deliberate forgetting. And that key was about to unlock the true origin of an entire family whose history had been methodically, almost surgically, destroyed. This is the story of what was hidden in that little girl's eyes. And I warn you now, it will change the way you think about identity, about ancestry, and about what the human body remembers, even when every document, every ledger, and every official record has been scrubbed clean. Before we step into the archive, a brief pause. If stories like this move you, if you believe that forgotten histories deserve not just to be recovered, but to be told with the reverence they are due, then please subscribe to this channel and leave a like. It takes 2 seconds, and in the algorithm of a world that prefers distraction to depth, that small act means everything. It tells us you are still listening. Now let us travel back to the year 1882 to a rain-smeared window in Washington, D.C., where a man named Dr. James O'Cuffer had spent 15 years of his life doing something that most people consider impossible: reconstructing lost genealogies, stitching together the fragmented stories of people whose names had been deliberately torn out of history's ledger. His office at Howard University was a small, cluttered sanctuary lined with framed photographs. But none of them were of his own family. They were strangers, people whose names had been erased, whose faces had been left behind like orphans without a last name. Each frame on his wall represented a case he had solved, a life reclaimed, a silence broken. He was, in many ways, a detective of the dead. The morning Diane walked into his office, it was raining. A steady, miserable Washington drizzle that seemed to wash the color out of everything. She was in her early 50s, dressed in a practical gray coat, and she carried a flat cardboard envelope the way people carry something truly irreplaceable, pressed close to her chest, both arms wrapped around it, as if she were protecting it not just from the weather, but from the very cruelties of time itself. "My grandmother left it to me," she said, setting the envelope carefully on his desk, her voice quiet but steady. "And her grandmother left it to her. Nobody knows who these people are, not their names, not where they came from, nothing." James slowly opened the envelope. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with decades, was a photograph approximately 8 by 10 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing. A cabinet card, the standard format for portraits in the 1880s, but in remarkably fine condition. The edges were browned and slightly warped, as all old things are, but the image itself remained sharp and clear, as if the people inside it had been waiting patiently all this time for someone to ask the right questions. A family of 7 stood inside a photographer's studio. The backdrop behind them was a painted garden scene, a common affectation of the era, meant to suggest a leisure and permanence that most of their real lives had likely never known. The father stood at the center, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit and a tie tightened to the throat. His expression was composed, almost severe, the way many people looked in photographs from that period because long exposure times demanded absolute stillness. One blink, one nervous twitch, and the entire image would blur into a ghost. Beside him sat a woman, presumably the mother, in a wooden chair. She wore a high-collared blouse with buttons running all the way to her chin, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that suggested both patience and exhaustion. Arranged around them with careful deliberation were 5 children, 2 older boys standing on the left, 2 younger girls seated on a low bench in the front, and 1 girl, the youngest, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing slightly apart at the far right of the frame, as if she had been told to wait there and had obeyed without question. At the bottom of the cardboard backing, in faded ink that had once been black and was now closer to the color of dried mud, someone had written a single date, October 14th, 1882. No name, no location, no studio stamp on the reverse, only a faint, rectangular ghost where a photographer's imprint had once been carefully, deliberately scraped away. James studied the photograph for a long, silent moment, the way a physician studies a wound. Then he picked up the magnifying glass from his desk. "Has anyone ever looked at this closely?" he asked. Diane shook her head. "Not really. We always assumed it was just a portrait." James brought the glass to the image, moving slowly, left to right, top to bottom, cataloging the small forensic markers that were the tools of his trade, the style of lapels, the grain of cardboard, the quality of the chemical emulsion, and that was when something stopped him cold. He almost missed it, a detail so subtle that a less patient eye would have slid right past it. The magnifying glass had moved across the photograph methodically, as it always did, searching for context clues. He had already noted several things. The high-collared suits on the boys suggested the early 1880s rather than the 1870s. The painted garden backdrop was consistent with studio practices in the American South during the Reconstruction era. The quality of the paper and the mounting card suggested a photographer with professional standing, not a frontier amateur, but someone with access to decent equipment and chemical supplies. Whoever this family was, they had made a deliberate choice to be photographed by someone competent. A small luxury, but a luxury nonetheless. Then the magnifying glass reached the youngest girl, the one standing apart at the far right of the frame, and James paused. Her face was turned very slightly toward the camera, as if she had moved just before the shutter was released. A child's impatience, perhaps, or a subtle defiance. In that slight turn, both of her eyes became visible, and they were not the same. Even in the sepia tones of a 19th-century photograph, the difference was unmistakable. Her left eye was dark, a deep, uniform darkness consistent with brown, the expected pigmentation for a black child of that era. But her right eye was lighter, noticeably, significantly lighter. Where the left eye absorbed light, the right eye reflected it differently, with an almost gray, pale quality that seemed to leap out of the image, demanding attention even in monochrome. James set the magnifying glass down and reached instead for the digital scanner on the shelf behind him. It took him 12 minutes to scan the photograph at high resolution and pull it onto his monitor. He used the enhancement software he had relied on for years, increasing contrast, adjusting gamma, sharpening focus digitally without altering the original file. When the enhanced image filled the screen, and he zoomed in on the girl's face, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a very long time. The right eye was blue-gray, clearly, unmistakably blue-gray, rendered in the subtle gradations of light that the original photograph had captured without anyone ever noticing. A black child, 1882, one brown eye, one blue-gray eye. He turned to Diane, who was watching him with an expression that hovered between curiosity and fear. "Tell me everything you know about this family," he said. "Everything." And Diane knew very little. That was the honest truth, and she said so without embarrassment. The photograph had been passed down through 4 generations of women, grandmother to daughter, daughter to granddaughter, always with the same vague instruction: keep this, it matters. But no one had ever been able to say why. No names had survived alongside it. No letters, no documents, no oral history specific enough to be useful. "My great-great-grandmother received it from someone she called the old woman," Diane said. "That's all I know. The old woman gave it to her before she died and told her not to lose it." James nodded slowly, still staring at the screen. He typed quickly and pulled up a medical reference database he had bookmarked years ago. Not something a genealogist typically consulted. But James had learned long ago that genetics and history were not separate disciplines. They were the same story, told in different languages. Waardenburg syndrome, type 2A, autosomal dominant inheritance pattern. He read the entry the way a detective reads a case file, looking for the specific, the actionable, the visible. Waardenburg syndrome is a genetic condition affecting pigmentation of the hair, skin, and eyes. The most visually distinctive features include heterochromia, irises of 2 different colors, and a white forelock, a patch of white or silver hair at the front of the scalp. It is caused by mutations in several genes, most commonly PX3, MITF, or EDNB, all of which affect the development and migration of melanocytes, the cells responsible for pigmentation. James underlined the phrase autosomal dominant in his mind. It meant that the mutation only needed to be inherited from one parent to express itself. And it meant, crucially, that in a family line where the mutation existed, it would appear again and again, generation after generation, in roughly half of all children. If the little girl in the 1882 photograph had Waardenburg syndrome, she had inherited it from one of her parents, and that parent had inherited it from one of their parents, and so on, an unbroken biological thread running backward through time, through slavery, through the Middle Passage, all the way back to a single ancestor, somewhere on the African continent. He turned back to the enhanced image on the screen. The girl's pale right eye, luminous against her dark face, looked back at him across 140 years. "This child," he said carefully, "has a genetic condition called Waardenburg syndrome. It's hereditary, dominant, it doesn't skip generations the way some conditions do." Diane leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "What does that mean?" "It means," James said, "that this didn't start with her." He spent the rest of that afternoon in the digital archive, scanning every millimeter of the photograph again, this time looking not at the girl's eyes, but at the other faces in the frame, searching for the thread. The 2 older boys showed nothing obvious. Their eyes, in the enhanced image, appeared uniformly dark. The mother's face was partially turned, her right eye obscured by a shadow that the original photographer had apparently not bothered to correct, a compositional oversight that had survived 140 years. The father's gaze was direct and steady, his eyes dark and symmetrical. Then James looked at the second girl, the one seated on the bench, slightly older than the child with heterochromia, perhaps 10 or 11. He had not paid her much attention before. She sat with her hands in her lap, her face fully toward the camera, her expression serious in the way of all children who have been told to hold still. Her eyes were uniformly dark. But at the top of her head, just above her left temple, partially hidden by the careful arrangement of her hair, was a section that the digital enhancement now made impossible to ignore. A patch perhaps 2 inches wide where the hair was strikingly lighter than the rest, not gray, not simply lighter, white. Bright flat white, the way a white forelock appears in old photographs. A small flag of absent pigmentation flying at the edge of an otherwise dark hairline. James sat very still, The white forelock, the hallmark of Waardenburg syndrome, present in a sibling without heterochromia. The mutation had expressed differently in each child, one inheriting the iris pigmentation difference, the other inheriting the depigmented hair. Both manifestations of the same underlying genetic change, both inherited from the same parent. He looked at the father again, then at the mother with her shadowed face. He reached for his phone and called his colleague in the genetics department, a woman named Dr. Patricia Ewan, who had worked with him on 3 previous ancestry reconstruction cases. "Patricia," he said when she answered, "I need you to look at something tomorrow morning, a photograph 1882. "What am I looking for?" "Waardenburg markers in 2 siblings, one with heterochromia, one with a white forelock." He paused. "And I need you to tell me which parent it came from, because one of those parents in the photograph has a shadow over their face, and I think that shadow is hiding something." There was a silence on the line, the kind of silence that precedes discovery. "I'll be there at 8, Patricia said. Dr. Patricia Ewan arrived the next morning with coffee and a hard drive. She was the kind of person who prepared before she asked questions, and by the time she sat down across from James, she had already pulled up 3 medical journals on Waardenburg syndrome type 2 on her laptop. She studied the enhanced photograph on James's screen without speaking for several minutes, zooming in on the girl with heterochromia, then on the older sister with the white forelock, then on mother's partially shadowed face. She tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when she was thinking. "The shadow isn't hiding the eyes," she said finally. "It's hiding the hair." She was right. When James adjusted the contrast on the mother's image, pushing the digital enhancement further than he had the previous day, a detail emerged at the mother's hairline, just above her left temple. The shadow that had obscured half her face had been cast by the studio lighting, but at the edge of that shadow, just barely visible, was a thin strip of lighter, toned hair. "The same position as the white forelock on the older daughter. She's the carrier," Patricia said quietly. "The mutation came through her." James leaned back in his chair. "A black woman in 1882 with Waardenburg syndrome. 2 children visibly expressing the trait. A photograph with no name, no location, no studio marking." The next step was clear: the Freedmen's Bureau records. After the Civil War, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, had attempted to document the lives of formerly enslaved people across the South. The records were incomplete, imperfect, often distorted by the prejudices of the agents who created them, but they were the closest thing to a census that existed for Black Americans in the years immediately following emancipation. James had a subscription to the digitized Freedmen's Bureau database, a project completed only a few years earlier after decades of painstaking indexing. He searched by physical description, which the Bureau records sometimes included, looking for any notation of unusual eye pigmentation. The search took most of the morning. At 11:47, a record appeared on his screen. A labor contract dated 1866 from a district in South Carolina. The contracting party was listed as a woman. Her first name was given as Eliza. Beside her name, in the careful handwriting of the Bureau agent, was a parenthetical notation: one eye brown, one eye gray, blue. Distinctive. James's hands went still on the keyboard. Eliza. The name sat on the screen like a stone dropped into still water. The labor contract listed her age as approximately 35 years old in 1866, which would have made her born around 1831. It listed no surname. Formerly enslaved people were frequently recorded without one in official documents from that period, or with the surname of a former enslaver that they had already discarded. It listed no place of origin. Only her name, her approximate age, the district in South Carolina where she was contracting her labor, and that single physical notation that had survived because a Bureau agent, for reasons James Would never know, had thought it worth writing down. One eye brown, one eye gray, blue, distinctive, he had a name. He had a rough birth year. He had a geographic location. And he had a genetic marker that functioned in this moment as a kind of fingerprint, a biological annotation written into her body that no document could erase. The next archive was harder. Slave manifests, the shipping documents used to record the transport of enslaved people along domestic slave trade routes, were among the most revealing and most brutal documents in American history. They listed human beings like cargo, name, age, height, physical description, and the name of the person who claimed ownership. They were created not out of any concern for the humanity of the people they listed, but because transporting enslaved people across state lines required legal documentation. James searched the digitized collections held by the National Archives and several university libraries, searching for records from South Carolina, referencing with the rough birth window he had for Eliza. He searched through manifests from the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, the decades during which Eliza would have been a child, then a young woman. On the second day, he found a manifest from 1849, a coastal shipping record from Charleston, South Carolina. Among the listed individuals was a girl, age approximately 18, first name Eliza. Beside her description, the agent who had prepared the manifest had written 2 words that confirmed everything: eyes different. James read those 2 words several times: eyes different. In the brutal transactional language of a slave manifest, a human being's most distinctive feature, the genetic inheritance she carried from her ancestors, had been recorded as a curiosity, a note in a ledger, 2 words that had waited 175 years to mean something. He picked up his phone and called Diane. "I found her," he said. "Her name was Eliza, and I know where she came from." Diane was at his office within the hour, her coat still on, her hands clasped on the desk, listening without interrupting as James walked her through everything: the Freedmen's Bureau record, the labor contract, the slave manifest from Charleston. He showed her each document on the screen, reading the relevant passages aloud, watching her face as the pieces assembled themselves into something coherent. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Eliza," she said, as if testing the weight of the name on her tongue. "That was her name? That's what the records suggest," James said. "The physical description matches the heterochromia, the notation in the labor contract, the timing. It's the same woman, with a high degree of confidence. She is the mother in this photograph." Diane nodded slowly. Then she said, "Where did she come from before Charleston, before South Carolina?" That was the question James had been waiting for. And it was the question he could not answer from documents alone. He had already contacted a genetic genealogy laboratory that specialized in ancestral DNA reconstruction, using historical family photographs as a starting point. The technology was relatively recent and still imperfect, but it had been used successfully in several high-profile ancestry cases. By analyzing the visible phenotypic markers in archival photographs, skin tone, eye color, facial morphology, in combination with genetic databases of known Waardenburg syndrome mutations, it was possible to narrow the geographic and ethnic origin of a mutation with meaningful precision. But there was another avenue: Diane herself. If she was a descendant of the family in the photograph, and the chain of custody through 4 generations of women made that overwhelmingly likely, then her own DNA carried the answer. "Have you ever done a genetic ancestry test?" James asked. "No." She paused. "Should I?" "I think you should, but not one of the commercial ones. I want to refer you to Patricia's lab. They can run a full mitochondrial DNA sequence. It traces your maternal line directly, mother to mother. Mother, as far back as the data can reach." Diane agreed without hesitation. The test took 11 days. When Patricia called James with the preliminary results, her voice had a quality he recognized: the careful, restrained excitement of a scientist who has found something significant and is not yet ready to say how significant. "The mitochondrial haplogroup," Patricia said, "is L3. specifically a subclade that the database associates with a very narrow geographic corridor. She paused. West Africa, Sierra Leone, and James, the Wardenberg mutation in this lineage matches a variant that's been documented in exactly one population group in the existing literature. That population group was the Mend. James knew the name. Most historians of the Atlantic slave trade did. The Mend people of Sierra Leone had been among the most heavily targeted ethnic groups during the final decades of the legal transatlantic slave trade, a period of intensified raiding and trafficking that preceded the British naval blockade of the West African coast. Their cultural identity, their language, their social structures had been among the most violently disrupted by the trade. They were also, as Patricia's database search confirmed, the only documented population in West Africa in which the specific PX3 gene mutation associated with Eliza's form of Wardenberg syndrome had been recorded in more than one individual. James spent 2 days reading everything he could find about the Mend, their communities, their history of resistance, their presence in the documented records of the transatlantic slave trade. And then, while searching through the digitized collection of the Amistad Research Center in New Orleans, a repository of records related to the African American experience, he found something he had not been looking for, a letter. It was handwritten, dated 1891, and addressed to no one by name. The writer identified herself only as a woman who was once called by another name. The letter was written in careful, deliberate English, the English of someone who had learned the language as an adult, in a country that was not their own. It had been donated to the archive in 1934 by a family in Charleston, along with a small collection of papers, and had been catalogued but rarely accessed. James read it twice before he was certain of what he was looking at. The woman described her childhood in a village near a river. She described being taken at night, along with other members of her family, by men who spoke a language she did not understand. She described a ship. She described arriving somewhere cold and unfamiliar. She described learning a new name, Eliza, because the name she had been given at birth was considered unpronounceable by the people who now claimed to own her. And near the end of the letter, in a passage that made James set down his coffee cup and sit very still, she wrote, "My mother had eyes that did not match, one dark as river mud, one pale as morning sky." She told me her mother had the same. She told me it was a sign that we came from a particular place, and that no matter how far we were taken, that sign would follow us. James read that sentence 4 more times, then he called Diane. He read her the letter over the phone. All of it. When he reached the passage about the eyes, she made a sound he could not quite name, not a word, not a cry, something in between. He waited until she was ready to speak. She wrote it herself. Diane said finally, "Yes." James said. In her own hand, she remembered everything, her village, her mother, the name she was born with. He paused. She didn't write that name in the letter. I think she was protecting it, keeping it private, but she described the place, the river, the geography. James had spent the previous evening referencing the geographic details in the letter against historical maps of Sierra Leone from the mid-19th century. The river she described, its width, its proximity to the coast, the type of trees she mentioned growing along its banks, was consistent with the Sewer River in the southern region of Sierra Leone. The Sewer River Valley had been Mend heartland for centuries. Patricia's mitochondrial DNA results, the Wardenberg mutation variant, the letter, the geography, they all pointed to the same place, the same people, the same origin. A family that had been photographed in a studio in South Carolina in 1882, with no name recorded and no history attached, had come from the banks of the Sewer River in Sierra Leone. Their ancestor had been taken from that river valley sometime in the 1830s or 1840s, during the final brutal years of the transatlantic slave trade. She had survived the crossing. She had survived enslavement. She had raised children and grandchildren on soil that was not her own. And she had carried in her irises, in her children's hair, in the DNA of every descendant who followed, an unbreakable biological record of where she had come from. James thought about the little girl in the photograph, the one standing apart at the far right of the frame. Her face turned just slightly toward the camera, one eye dark and one eye pale. A 7-year-old child in 1882 who had no way of knowing that the thing that made her different was also the thing that would one day lead a historian 140 years into the future to the name of her great-grandmother's river. He thought about what it meant to carry something in your body that you cannot see or feel or name. Something that outlasts everything else, that outlasts the ships and the auctions and the ledgers and the silence. He sat with that thought for a long time. Then he began preparing what he would tell Diane the following morning. Diane came to James's office one last time on a Thursday morning in October, almost exactly 6 weeks after she had first walked in with the photograph pressed against her chest in the rain. She sat across from him at the same desk. The photograph was there between them, still in its cardboard envelope, still in the careful condition in which 4 generations of women had kept it. James laid everything out in order: the Freedmen's Bureau record, the labor contract, Patricia's DNA analysis, the letter from the Amistad Research Center, the historical maps, the mend people of the Sewer River Valley in Sierra Leone. Each document was a step in a staircase that descended one generation at a time. From a photography studio in South Carolina in 1882 to a village on a West African riverbank sometime in the 1830s. Diane listened to all of it without speaking. She looked at each document. She held the letter, a printed copy. The original was too fragile to handle freely, and read the passage about the mismatched eyes twice. When James finished, she looked at the photograph for a long time. She didn't know. Diane said quietly, "The little girl, she didn't know what her eyes meant?" "No." James said she couldn't have, but her great-grandmother knew. She wrote it down. Diane looked up. She wanted someone to know. She wrote it in a language that wasn't hers, in a country that wasn't hers, and she left it for someone to find. James nodded. "You found it," he said. "It just took 140 years." Diane picked up the photograph and looked at the little girl at the edge of the frame. The girl who had moved slightly just before the shutter closed, the girl whose pale right eye had caught the studio light in a way that no one had noticed or thought to question for a century and a half. The family had no recorded name. Their story had been deliberately, systematically erased, first by the institution of slavery, then by the indifference of history. But the erasure had not been complete. It had never been complete. Because written into the biology of that child, into the cells of her iris, into the genes she had inherited from her mother, who had inherited them from her mother, who had been taken from the bank of a river in Sierra Leone, was a record that no document could destroy. Diane set the photograph back down on the desk. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said her name was Eliza, but somewhere on the Sewer River she had another name, and now I know where to look for it. She picked up the photograph, tucked it back into its cardboard envelope, and held it against her chest, both arms around it. The same way she had carried it into this office 6 weeks before, in the rain. DNA does not forget. It cannot be confiscated, burned, or renamed. It simply waits, and sometimes, after long enough, someone finally knows how to read it.